Okay, it's recording.
All right.
All right. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good day to all our viewers across the globe, and welcome to another interesting and enthralling episode of Global Arena, an intercontinental panel interview on my YouTube channel, Global Arena TV, that hosts experts from different corners of the globe to talk us through a plethora of experiences they have been bestowed upon. And we look at different issues from different angles. My name is Umar Isa Dendago, and I'm the host of the show. On today's show, we ask, how popular are the Chinese films? B, is there anything significant to learn apart from the martial arts? What do they normally focus on? Is it spreading the Communist Party's and Xi Jinping's propaganda, as some people in the West put it? And why are the Bollywood films more popular in Nigeria, especially in northern Nigeria, than their Chinese counterparts? Well, this and many more will thoroughly be scrutinized on the show by my panel of experts. And to do that, I'm joined from Kano State, Nigeria by Professor Abdallah Uba Adamu, a double professor of science education and media and cultural communication, former vice chancellor of National Open University of Nigeria. Professor Abdallah Uba Adamu has written and spoken a lot about Hollywood, Bollywood, and even Kannywood, the Hausa film industry that belongs to the northern Nigeria. Professor Abdallah Uba Adamu is a prolific writer and a public speaker, an inspiration and also a role model to young people that are growing up to be like him. Thank you very much indeed, Professor, for being on the show.
Thank you very much. You're welcome.
Yes, and I think I'm going to have to mention this, make it categorically clear to my viewers that this year, 2023, has served as 1 decade since you became my mentor, and thank you very much for that.
I'm glad. I'm very glad. And you are a very good mentee also, willing to learn, ready to learn, and ready to put whatever you have learned into practice. I'm very proud of you. Keep it up.
Thank you very much. I like this in an American style. Give it up. Yeah, and from the UK, I've got Professor Chris Berry, a professor of film studies specializing in the Chinese films from King's College London. In fact, he is one of the leading experts in this field. That's field of film studies, Chinese film studies. By the way, Professor Chris has appeared in many TV shows, one of which is The Listening Post of Al Jazeera. In fact, it is one of my favorite TV shows back then, like some 4 or 5 years ago, in which they talk about the popularity of the Chinese films. And he is going to help us know whether or not the Chinese films are popular in the West. If they are, then why? And if they are not, then why? Is it because of the political and diplomatic turmoil and tension and dynamics that happens between, or that exists, has been in existence for long, between the West and the East? Well, Professor, thank you very much indeed, Professor Chris Berry from King's College London, for being on the show.
And thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, with just one email, Professor Chris Berry said, "Oh, Umar, I'm in. When do you want us to do?" So thank you once again. So let's get to the crux of the program. But before then, I'm very much interested to hear something about the basics here. I'd like both of you to tell us the reasons why you have been so much immersed in film studies. Professor Chris Berry, let me start with you.
That's an interesting question. I actually was brought up in quite a conservative household, and we didn't go to the movies. We were supposed to listen to classical music. And it was only when I was a student that I started to go astray and watch a lot of movies. And I did my BA in Chinese studies. But then, of course, because I'd watched so many movies, I started studying film formally. I did my MA and PhD in film studies and combined the two things. My MA and PhD were, yes, in the US. And I combined the two. And then I've been working on Chinese film ever since then. So for more than 40 years now.
why not the power dynamics between the East and the West, between the Chinese and the Western people? Why did you take a turn? Because, like, simply in my little understanding, the Chinese studies combine about their cultures, the politics, the leadership, the Communist Party, and so on and so forth. I'm a political journalist. That's why I'm interested in such stuff. Why not these stuff? Why did you take a turn and look at only one aspect? That's movies, that's films.
When I was an undergraduate student, there were not many Mandarin speakers in the UK. Most Chinese people in the UK at that time were from southern China and they spoke Cantonese. So when they were training us in my BA, they used quite a few films from China to help us hear Mandarin and get used to listening to it. And those films, for me, were quite strange, because they came out of a socialist industry that was so different from Hollywood. And they all had a very clear political message, and were sort of about development and so on. I was very curious about them, and really that led me to try to understand the importance and the role of movies more. And also because personally, I like movies more than I like politics. So
Wow.
the honest truth.
Yeah, just like Professor Abdallah. Professor Abdallah, come in. Why have you been so much interested in movies?
It's very interesting. While Chris' experience was about conservatism, raising up in a conservative, maybe Christian household and so on, I grew up in a Muslim and extremely radical household. My dad
Radical.
was radical. He was a liberal, real liberal. And I grew up in the heart of conservative Kano City. But my dad was all about music and films. For quite a few years, we get all these weird looks that we are. In fact, there are some people who even accuse us of being Christian simply because we like what is seen as Christian music and so on. I'll never forget the fact that in 1969, when I was 13 years old, my dad gave me a gift of a guitar. So seeing a guitar in the heart of a Muslim household in the city was something. And we used to go out together with my dad to buy records. Look, at that time they had these vinyl things. We used to buy together, and I've always been interested in Western music. At that time, of course, racially, through a prism of racial music, that is black music and so on. It was much later that I became involved with European music. And when I say European music, I mean, I'm talking about heavy metal, electronic music, punk, and all that. And heavy metal has always been my favorite music. Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, the whole work. But I stayed true to the path. I was a student who was supposed to be a science student and so on, but I wasn't very good at science at all. So I ended up as a science education student. So I was admitted into the university in 26, I think 1976.
76, yeah.
Yeah, 1976, when I was just 20 years old. That's when I read science education as a biologist. So would you believe that? I mean, I was supposed to be a biology teacher, but I found teaching boring, really, really boring. But I was lucky enough, my grades were good enough to be employed in the local university as a science education teacher. So I was teaching people how to teach science to younger people. But my perception of science was also a little bit radical because I was focusing on the philosophy of science, about why we need to teach science. It's not about manpower production, but it's about changing mindsets of people, about being logical, about being rational, about demanding for evidence, and so on. And in that process, Karl Popper became my image, the kind of person that I really believe conveys science, together with Thomas Kuhn and so on. But my ideas are not really welcome. All they want me to do is teach teachers how to become good science teachers. To be frank with you, I found it very boring, but I stuck to it because it put food on the table. And until 1996, so from 1976 to 1996, I was in the wilderness, as it were. I was doing things that I really don't enjoy doing. But I was writing in science education, and so I got enough points to become a professor in 1997. And the moment I became a professor, I said, that's it. Sayonara, goodbye, hasta la vista. So I stopped bothering with education because at that particular period, the Islamic culture in northern Nigeria started criticizing the newly emergent film industry. They were saying they were corrupt. They were accusing them of being corrupt, of corrupting people's morals, of copying Indian and so on. And I say, hey, now this is what I'm talking about. It's a new area. Let me look at it. Let me use all my scientific training as a researcher and go into this area that I know nothing about. And of course, those who are already in the area started accusing me of cross-carpeting to the area without the necessary expertise. So I said, okay, no problem. I'll learn. So I moved into Frankfurt School, into film studies, into all that. And for about 2 or 3 years, I was engaged in self-teaching. And by the time I got ready in about 1999, I started writing articles in the newspapers. And then I started creating all sorts of debates about this. My stand was, this is something that needs to be documented. This is something that to be noticed. And this is something that we need to understand. My scientific background prevented me from passing a judgment. This is neither good or bad. It is something that is happening. And since it is happening, we need to document it. We need to understand it. We need to understand its trajectory, and we need to understand where it is going. But I don't say, oh, this is horrible. Oh, this is bad. Oh, this is terrible. I don't.
No, you
I don't
should
have.
say. You should
Why
say
should
this
I?
is horrible.
No,
Yeah,
no,
because
no.
you have
There is,
ethics. You as a human
I
being, you
have
have
ethics.
ethics, and there are things
I,
that
I have morals.
go
I have
contrary to
ethics.
the ethics.
Yeah, I perfectly understand. I have morals, I have ethics, but I'm not using my own moral judgment on this or my own ethical judgment on this. I am a scholar. I'm detached. I'm looking at what is happening. If the moment I start saying this is right, this is wrong, then I'm altering the field landscape. I'm trying to infuse views, opinions, and perspectives that shouldn't be there. All I'm interested in, this is an undisturbed field. I'm an ecologist, remember? This is a field that it's
Yeah.
undisturbed. And I'm just saying there is a particular plant there is a particular animal there. That's all I do. The moment I begin to answer, no, this animal shouldn't be there. That plant shouldn't be there. I'm altering it. I'm changing it. I don't have the right as a researcher to alter, to engage myself, to embed myself into what I am looking at. So I wasn't interested. And I got a lot of accusations from colleagues. I'm encouraging bad behavior. I'm encouraging this. Because what they want me to do is to say, this is horrible and condemn it. I'm not a sheikh. I'm not a malam. I'm not a preacher. I'm not a religious consultant. I'm a researcher. A researcher describes what they see so that other people can also come and describe it. The moment I start altering it, then it is no longer what it is.
Yeah, but in
So
research, there are recommendations. Whenever you write a research, you do a research, you put forward some recommendations that needs to be done or a call to action. This is a school of thought in research methods.
Well, my school of thought is different. There is no recommendation in research. Your job is not to force people into a particular direction. Who says your research is right? I mean, you are able only to capture a particular aspect at a particular moment. And then now you are saying this is what should be done in order to alter something that has been developing for like 100 years or so. No, your job as a researcher is to document and report, but not to judge. By the time you begin to say, we should recommend this, we should recommend that, look at human nature. In Kano State, we had a change of government, Chris, about a week or two ago, and the new government is undoing what the old government did. That's research recommendation for you. The moment you create a recommendation, you are no longer leaving the field intact. You have spoiled it. You have changed it. And in any case, recommend what? Film industry, they are copying Indians. So what should I say? Stop copying Indians. Why should they? They like it. They want it. They make money out of it. Who am I to say they should stop copying Indians? And they even said so themselves. We will not stop copying Indians because we make a lot of money out of copying Indians. When we make our own original films, we don't make money. So I tell them, stop copying Indians, make your original film. And they're not making money. So what do you want me to do? Go to the public and say, public, please buy their films. Is that my job? So I try not to alter the landscape at all. So this is how I somehow got in. And the next thing I know, getting involved with the media and cultural studies, traveling all over the place, particularly to Germany and talking about this, made my university ask me to present my papers for another professorship. So I was appointed as a professor of media and cultural communication, in addition to the one that I had in science education in 2012. So I have two professorships, but Chris, I have only one salary, okay? They don't pay. They don't pay me 2 salaries. They only give me 1 salary. But it's fun for me because
Yeah.
it's not so much about self-aggrandizement, but about knowing that you can change the future trajectory of your career. You don't have to be stuck in the same place, doing the same boring things and not getting any capital out of it. And I think my position as a double professor in Nigeria gives younger people hope. You're not stuck in a rut. I mean, you are stuck in a place and you think, oh my God, I'm going to do this for the next 40 years till retirement. I hate it. I'm bored. Get out, move out, and do something else. And you never can tell. The reward will come later. Be yourself. Be what you want to be. And I think that's the lesson from this double professorship thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, of course. Thank you very much, Professor Abdallah. Professor Chris, you've been immersed, you've been so much engaged in this field of Chinese film studies, for example. What areas do you normally focus on? For example, the martial arts, the use of language, the use of political influence, like the Chinese Communist Party's influence, spreading it in the films. Also, just briefly tell us.
Well, I started out focused on People's Republic of China films from probably the late 1970s into the early 1980s. And I was looking then at how the films in that period told the story of what had happened earlier, just a few years before, in the Cultural Revolution, which had been repudiated then, right? And they made a lot of films retelling those stories and trying to bring out the repressed memories of how difficult that period had been. At that time, we're talking in the 1980s, there were not many of us working on Chinese film, and I, focused on this very particular thing. But gradually, I have covered more and more things in the Chinese-speaking world. However, I would still say my focus, is usually, not always, but usually on Mandarin cinema, because that's the Chinese language I speak. So I'm a little more hesitant. I mean, I do write about Hong Kong films. I do write about films in Taiwanese language, in Minnanhua, but less often than I focus on Mandarin films. And I've gone back in history and so on. I think because I was one of the early people to be writing in English on Chinese film, there's been a kind of expectation that I should have a lot more expertise than I really have, But I try to, gradually, as Professor Abdullah was saying, extend my knowledge, do new things, because otherwise it gets boring. And so I've covered a lot of different things over time.
Yeah, in the course of your explanation, you talked about the Hong Kong films and the Chinese Mandarin films. Are there any differences between the films produced in mainland China, Beijing, Shanghai, and then the ones produced in Taiwan, the disputed island, roughly 100 miles off the coast of Southeast China, and then Hong Kong, which is also another disputed area, another disputed territory, which was given back to the Chinese in the 1990s by the British, by you people, of course.
Not
What's
by
the
me
difference?
personally, yes.
Your government. I don't know
yes,
whether it was Margaret Thatcher's government, I think, at that time, right?
Indeed, it was, yes. So I think that there's no simple answer to your question, because, of course, there are a lot of connections and links between these different cinema industries, but also differences. Historically, the big difference is in the Cold War era, when the socialist film industry in the People's Republic of China was being run not as an entertainment industry to make profits, but as a pedagogical enterprise by the government that was intended to use cinema and its entertainment properties, its storytelling, its stars, its music, and so on, to get across the government's messages, the things they were concerned about at the time. Some of those were very political things. Some of them were more about social reform, or even, medical knowledge, for example, they would try to embed in films. On the other hand, Hong Kong and Taiwan during the Cold War were very much part of an entertainment commercial film industry model that took Hollywood and perhaps to a lesser extent Tokyo as the models for them to work with. And so those were the industries really, the major differences historically. Of course, in recent years, there have been more and more connections and more links. Since 1997, most of the Hong Kong industry has been absorbed into that Beijing-centered mainland industry. And the significant differences between Hong Kong and the mainland industry have become much smaller. In the meanwhile, Taiwan has gone its own way and has its own industry, which I think which maybe 20 or 30 years ago was more of an art film industry, but these days is more of a kind of small budget industry that is trying to tell local stories for local people and finding some success with that model.
All right, their target audiences are local audiences, not international audiences, as mostly the Hong Kong films are.
Well, historically, if we go back to the 1980s, there were a lot of Taiwanese art films that were going around the film festivals and were very, very successful. But those films were not locally popular because they were art films. The local regular audience didn't relate to them. So in recent years, I think the filmmakers have been much more focused on making films that the local audience can enjoy. Of course, they also hope those films will travel, but the main aim is getting the local audience. For Hong Kong, I think that until 1997, Hong Kong was, if you will, the cultural capital of the Chinese diaspora, the people outside the People's Republic. And so people in Malaysia, in Chinatown, in San Francisco, wherever, were very eager to watch those Hong Kong films. And that's one of the reasons why many of them became globally known. But of course, since 1997, there's been a big turning inwards. And because they have access now to that market in the mainland, and that market has gone from being a market of poor people to a market of more middle-class people. Of course, Hong Kong filmmakers are very focused on that 1.3 billion market and not so focused on, trying to export in the way they did in the past.
Yeah, before I go to Professor Abdallah and get to know how much he knows about the Chinese films and how popular they are in northern Nigeria, Professor Chris Berry, I want to understand this. If I were to watch Hong Kong films, say, I don't know, probably Jackie Chan is from Hong Kong, to the best of my knowledge. If I were to watch Hong Kong films, would I learn about the dispute, the diplomatic tension or political tension between the mainland China of Xi Jinping, the Beijing, and then the government of Hong Kong, for example? The Chinese government believes in one China system. What do they call it? One government, one country, two systems.
Yes,
one country,
that's
two
right.
systems.
Yes.
So, am I going to understand the gravity of the situation, or no? Simply because China is the major market of the Hong Kong films, they do not manifest, they do not show those things.
Okay, so this is a very complicated question, I'm afraid.
I'm a political
So it's going to be hard for me to give you a really short answer. But let's say before 2019, the recent protests, right, which was so dramatic in Hong Kong. Before that, it's absolutely true that the censorship situation in Hong Kong was much more liberal than in mainland China. Hong Kong filmmakers, I think, could be said to fall into perhaps three categories. One were filmmakers who just basically abandoned is an emotional word, but left Hong Kong behind because they saw that opportunity in the mainland. And so they went to the mainland, right? and they fully got involved in the mainland industry. Hong Kong's population is perhaps 5 or 6 million compared to 1.3 billion, and the 1.3 billion are now, at least 400 or 500 million of them are middle class, so there's a lot more money to be made if you're a film producer and a filmmaker in the mainland. Another part of the Hong Kong film industry decided to stay in Hong Kong, to make Hong Kong-based films, but always to be trying to make sure those films could also pass the Beijing censor, much stricter censor, and also be released in the mainland. And then a tiny but very significant number of filmmakers decided to make Hong Kong films for Hong Kong audiences, low budget, knowing they cannot pass the Beijing censors. So in that final category of films I just talked about, that's where you're going to find documentaries and some feature films that in numerous ways, directly and indirectly, address issues to do with Hong Kong-Beijing relations and tensions, I think more between the people and Beijing, the Beijing government. The Hong Kong government is basically controlled through Beijing. So you're not going to find, the Hong Kong government is not in tension with Beijing. It's entirely, a puppet of Beijing. Puppet is maybe too strong, but it's under their control. Since 2019, of course, there's been an enormous crackdown. And so that space of films that are directly critical of Beijing, being able to pass Hong Kong censors, but not Beijing censors, and so being able to be shown in Hong Kong, but not in Beijing, that space has disappeared. There are still differences. There is still a separate Hong Kong censorship process that will allow some films through that could not be shown in the mainland, but it's not because they are directly critical. It may be because they touch on topics that are fine in Hong Kong, but not so much in Beijing. And I'm going to give you an example. There was a film earlier this year, which has been a huge box office success, and which, of course, as I'm talking, I can't remember the name of, so I have to forgive me. But it's a film about a law case, and the whole point of it is set maybe 10, 15 years ago. So it's after the handover. And the point of the film is that it shows an effort to deliver justice to a young woman who has wrongly been found guilty previously. And it shows the trial by jury system at work, which is that British-derived legal system. So within the logic of one country, two systems, that's why that British system still continues. And it's fine to show that in a film in Hong Kong, but not as something that I think the Beijing government wants shown in mainland China, where there is no trial by jury, right? So this is an example of a film that can still be made in Hong Kong, doesn't directly criticize Beijing or have anything to do with that, but is not releasable in mainland. I hope that helps answer. Yeah.
Yes, of course, I can see Professor Abdallah nodding his head. Of course, this is comprehensive. Professor Abdallah, are you a fan of Chinese movies?
No.
Capital no.
Yeah, capital, absolutely no. I don't watch them.
Okay.
I only watch Hollywood movies, okay? I only watch action films, Hollywood films, and that's it. No Chinese, no all this Kung Fu stuff.
May I know why?
Zed.
Right.
But really, I grew up with my own intellectual compass shaped by American films. When I was a small boy, my dad was giving